He challenged the ideas, he challenged the views, he challenged the opinions. He challenged the leadership. What are we doing? Are we challenging leadership enough? We have the 2009 elections coming up sooner or later. 3 people, all of them, Frankenstein, John McCain, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who I see Spike Lee in yesterday's paper wants to basically mooting for him to go into presidency. But who is this lady, Hillary Clinton, for example? There was talk for some time now that she's lost the Democratic race, and the race seems to be between Obama and John McCain. It's quite interesting that all these particular individuals, their political ideas and their views in terms of running the United States doesn't change, doesn't seem to be significantly different. Hillary Clinton, of course, has had a background of organized corruption on a massive scale. Of course, we don't have a time for that, but certainly she was an individual who rose from what they called in the 60s culture, and subsequently transmogrified to the so-called radical left, seeking to have what they call fomenting revolutionary changes. But in fact, at one particular time, she sought to establish a platform which would give her the power to exercise absolute real power and real world leadership, to the extent that it basically does away with people of other. What's the commonality between all these 3 people? All of them spoke of a confrontation with Iran. So there's not much difference in terms of their foreign policy objectives. You find that even the economic policies that they seem to espouse are not clearly different. All of them are capitalists. All of them come from a neoliberal background. Barack Obama, who's his mentor? His mentor is an individual called Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, I haven't got a portrait of Brzezinski. He's probably in his late 70s now. But Brzezinski was at one time the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, 1979. What's so important about that? Brzezinski was one of the key individuals who sought to establish and financially support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And what did they then do is that he wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. And he spoke about an idea that if one has to control the oil region in the Caspian Basin in Central Asia, one will effectively control the economy, the oil industry in the world. And if you control the oil industry in the world, it would be an ideal situation for establishing your power base. So what did Brzezinski do is that he created a confrontation with the Soviet Union in '79. How? Without any provocation on their part, they channeled funds via the CIA through the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence. And so they got young people, people like you, ordinary innocent people, who are basically part of a bigger game, channeling them with funds on a massive scale in order to de-establish the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, I beg your pardon, the socialist government which was in control in Afghanistan in the 70s, to do away with them. And once they did away with them, it basically provoked Soviet invasion into Afghanistan. And subsequently what happened was that you had this war for the past decade, since the 70s right up till 1990. Once the objectives were achieved in 1989, once the Soviet Union was destabilized, once communism, in a manner of speaking, fell apart, what happened? They left these so-called Mujahideen to their own. And naturally speaking, being armed, they then engaged in sanguinary warfare, in civil warfare. So a community with that background, what happens? It radicalizes. It takes extreme positions. It basically enmeshes itself with the Pashtun tribal custom. And then, of course, it appropriates an Islamic characteristic to that. So a community, a grouping, which arose out of a particular context, is then played on a massive scale. And then, of course, you have the mass media, which portrays or portrayed the Taliban. Coming back to what I'd said, we in our communities are afraid to challenge the establishment. We are afraid to challenge politicians. We're even afraid to challenge our own religious leaders. In 2000, you see the term here called neocons. Does anyone know what a neocon is? Neocolonization or neoconservative. What's a neocon? Neocon is a neoconservative, someone who has conservative ideas, ultra-orthodox ideas, and so on. Now, who you see here, these particular individuals, people like, this guy here, Rumsfeld, John Bolton, he was the editor of the Weekly Standard, people like Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and so on. This was the former head of the CIA, Zalmay Khalilzad, and so on. What happened was that in 1997, an organization was established by this chap here called Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. And they called the organization called Project for the New American Century. The Project for the New American Century and the people basically involved in it, are personnel or individuals which were highly significant to past and current events. In other words, most of these people who, at the time of the formation of the organization, were academics, lawyers, people who had a degree of influence, but they were not people in the administration, in the Clinton administration. They developed a blueprint called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And what was some of their blueprint? If I could read out some of the points which were raised. They said US military control of the Gulf region, whether or not Saddam Hussein was in power, whilst the unresolved conflict, this is the word, listen, whilst the unresolved conflict with Iraq provides the immediate justification, the need for a substantial American force present in the Gulf transcends the issue of the regime of Saddam Hussein. The US is to fight, decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars as a core mission. The US forces are to be the cavalry of the new American empire or the new American frontier. Action to discourage advanced industrial nations from challenging US leadership or from aspiring to a larger regional or global role. Therefore, South Africa cannot challenge the United States. It has to kowtow in terms of their policies, in terms of their economic views, in terms of the way it sets up its economy. It has to basically market itself or place itself in subservience to this dominant power. And it says ensuring that peacekeeping missions have American political leadership rather than that of the United Nations. Permanent US bases where? In places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Increase military pressure on China. It's time to increase the presence of American forces in Southeast Asia, which will lead to American and allied power, providing the spur for the process of democratization in China, which means control. Democratization in Iraq, control. Power, we control the economy, you are subservient, and so on. But deep down, these individuals were behind this particular policy document, written in 1997. It so happened that all these individuals ended up forming part and parcel of the Bush administration. Wolfowitz, Deputy Defense Secretary. Donald Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary. This man here, I'll show you a picture later on. People like Zalmay Khalilzad. Who was Zalmay Khalilzad? He was the ambassador to Afghanistan. What was Zalmay Khalilzad's role before? He had joined the Bush administration. He was part and parcel of an oil company. People like Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard, a right-wing tabloid, coming with extreme ideas, shaping and fomenting American society. Richard Pearl, called a string of pearls. One of the individuals who, the so-called godfather behind all these people, is a chap called Leo Strauss, a German individual, German-born philosopher, who believed that people must be governed by a pious elite, a certain selected elite. And he must have missed the fact that they already are. According to an internet article which I picked up, Strauss thought, and I give the quotation, that the best way for ordinary human beings to raise themselves above the beasts is to be utterly devoted to their nation and willing to sacrifice their lives for it. He recommended a rabid nationalism and a militant society modeled on ancient Sparta. He thought that this was the best hope for a nation to be secure against her external enemies, as well as the internal threat of decadence, sloth, and pleasure. Nationalism, nation-state. My nation, right or wrong. That's what Islam comes and destroys. Because Islam destroys the entire concept of the nation-state. It doesn't believe, I'm not saying physically destroying it, I'm saying the philosophy of Islam is supranational. You look at Surah Hujurat, chapter 49, verse 13 of the Quran. What does it state? Ya ayyuhan nasu, O mankind, inna khalaqnakum min dhakari wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu. O mankind, we created you from a single pair and made you into nations and tribes that you may recognize each other, not that you may despise each other. It says, verily, the most exalted of you in the sight of God, the highest of you is who? He who is best, most righteous in conduct. Not your belief, not your race, not your tradition, not your culture, not your ideas, not your philosophy, whatever. It's one who is righteous in conduct, establishes an egalitarian society. That cannot be found in any other philosophy. That particular verse of absolute equality in humanity cannot be found in any other religious scripture on earth today except the Quran. You look at the New Testament, you find discrimination there. You look at the Hinduism, you find rampant discrimination in terms of the caste and cultural differences. You find it existent in the Indian community, where you have the so-called ethnic differences in play. You find it even in the African communities, where there's this kind of indirect form of discrimination between the Xhosas and the Zulus and so on. In fact, the word Zulu, who knows where the word Zulu comes from? What does the word Zulu mean? It means people from the skies, someone from the skies. So the Zulus, and you see, we've got an individual in the office called Fahim who I debate and discuss all the time, and he says that from Zulus, you have all the tribes in Africa, but that's also kind of a superiority which people basically seem to promulgate and so on. But that's a type of superiority complex which is not acceptable in Islamic society. It's not acceptable in Indian society. It's not acceptable in white society. One of the most grotesque types of racism we've seen in today's society has been white on black. It so happened that not all whites are racist, but those particular people in positions of power happen to be white or happen to be coming from a particular Eurocentric worldview. But I'm saying all of us, white, black, colored, Indian, can only find absolute equality under the umbrella of Islam, not under the umbrella of any other philosophy or any other paradigm or any other ism for that matter. And as we go on, I'll show that Islam itself is also not a religion in the conventional sense of the word. So these are the kind of people that you find who are running the world. I mean, look at this guy. This is one of the most sickest people I've ever seen on earth. Do anyone know who he is? Who is he? Henry Kissinger. Have you heard of Henry Kissinger? Henry Kissinger. In fact, it's quite interesting that in the 70s, Kissinger had close links with Mugabe when Mugabe was basically fighting the illegitimate Smith regime, quite strangely enough. But this guy here was a neoconservative, ultra-right-wing individual long before the word had even been invented. He was the Secretary of State during the Nixon administration, one of the most corrupt administrations in the 70s. And you look at the writings of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, called Watergate. You heard of Watergate? Where the Democratic Party or the Republicans were spying on the Democratic Party, and he was the Secretary of State. At that particular point in time, one of his roles, one of the major roles that he became known for, and he's basically wanted for war crimes in Holland, was that in Cambodia, he authorized, which was at that point under, I think, socialist rule, he authorized, and since communism and the United States, Russia, the Soviet Union, the United States were fighting the Cold War, he authorized the mass carpet bombing of Cambodia. What did that result in? That resulted in the destruction of the population. It resulted in the formation of a group called the Khmer Rouge and the rise of Pol Pot. If you heard of Pol Pot and you see some of the atrocities committed by Pol Pot, which are deliberately left out, your eyes will pop out. People were tortured to death. They were boiled in water and their bones were basically left on the beds. Young children were taken and made to forcibly view the execution of their parents, who were chopped apart and their body parts were then sold and traded amongst the Khmer Rouge. But this individual, to give an example of his history, because the Cambodia was under communist rule and was, in one sense, a threat to the rise of the established American power, one of the ideal ways to do with it was to sponsor this guerrilla movement called the Khmer Rouge, and in fact give them financial support, and that's what the United States did. They provided financial support for these individuals, and that basically led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot coming to power, and leading to one of the worst genocides, a literal Holocaust. Worst, I would submit, than what happened in Nazi Germany during the Second World War, but something which was not basically kept at the fore. Now, there's an interesting DVD which I think is available at the IPCI called Cambodia, The Silent War by John Pilger. If I'm not mistaken, I think it might be available. And of course, if those of you are interested to view the DVD by Pilger and other DVDs, just basically contact our offices and so on. These are the kind of sick people we have in power. And I mean, it's quite amazing. If you look at they all seem to be nose pickers. I mean, look at the Queen Elizabeth II. These are the kind of people who are running the world today. And we've relinquished our power to them. We've relinquished our ideas to them. We've become lemmings for the established order, the established authority. So, this chap here, what I call him Big Dick Cheney. In fact, he was certainly the present U.S. Vice President, and he was the board advisor to the Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs, which was a think tank that placed Israel and its security at the heart of U.S. foreign policy. In fact, he was Defense Secretary to Father George Bush during the 1991 Gulf War, and back then he was the real power, and right now he's the real power in the White House until, of course, the elections behind the village idiot George Bush.